Yeah, this is Rico speaking. All right, C.O. Rico, Little Caesar, that's who.
Little Caesar is a gangster story about the rise and fall of Rico Bandello, Chicago criminal. It's much more about the rise of a tiny, squealy little guy who starts at the bottom, learns to dress well, learns to make his way in Chicago society as he makes more and more money, as he kills off all his enemies, and finally reaches the pinnacle of success as a gangster. And just when he reaches the top, it all comes tumbling down, and he ends up a depression bum, and then finally dies in the streets. It's sort of an anti-American dream story, and his very sad end is, I said, perhaps a warning to all of us that we all can tumble as quickly as we rise. There have always been gangster films from the beginning of filmmaking.
There was this tradition in the early silent cinema of films about the city and about crime in the city. D.W. Griffith made films like Musketeers of Pig Alley in 1912, and one of his actors, a man named Raoul Walsh, director of White Heat, for example, made a film called Regeneration.
It's pretty much a gangster film of that time, literally of the period 1914, 1915, and it's quite remarkable for its authenticity and for what it says again about that lifestyle.
Then, of course, after World War I, when amendment to the Constitution banning the sale of alcohol started the era of prohibition in the 1920s, and people who couldn't buy drinks legally began to buy drinks illegally. There were speakeasies in the cities and all around the country.
You could not go in and buy a drink officially. Of course, everybody was drinking, and everybody was in these little speakeasies.
A new kind of crime began to service the needs of legal alcohol and so on. And gangs in Chicago, the famous Al Capone and his compatriots there, became very powerful and successful.
And this was a wonderful world if you were a criminal. And of course, Little Caesar was a criminal, and that was his business, was the bootleg world.
Yeah, I ain't doing so bad in this business so far.
Some people see the story as an allegory about business, that Little Caesar, in a way, is a kind of really grotesque version of the American businessman who all through the 20s thought that we're just going to get richer and richer, and the stock market went higher and higher. And of course, in 1929, the stock market crashed.
Black Tuesday, October 29th. Confusion spreads through the canyons of New York City's financial district, and men stare wild-eyed at the spectacle of complete ruin.
Little Caesar's made in the end of 1930, and it's a period of when we're deep into the Depression.
And of course, with the Depression, there was a much stronger sense that the country was going out of control, so to speak, that people were getting more desperate.
People were suffering so badly from the Depression that they had to blame it on something, on someone.
So we have a cultural situation in America. And of course, the media come in, newspapers, and of course, the movies.
You guys are invited to this private party.
Suppose we don't want to stay.
And I wouldn't stop you for the world. Only these boys of mine have itching fingers. Sit down, gents.
There undoubtedly were people that cheered Little Caesar on. I mean, there were people that followed the real-life adventures of John Dillinger and Bonnie and Clyde and cheered them on because they saw them as anti-establishment and fighting back against those unseen powers that had thrown the country into a rather deep depression.
If you ain't out of town by tomorrow morning, you won't never leave it except in a pine box. I'm taking over this territory. From now on, it's mine.
Warner Brothers was a different type of cat than any other cats in Hollywood at this time. When you take a look at the studios during this classic period, they all more or less fall into a type of realism that I call romantic idealist realism, except for Warner Brothers.
Well, Warner Brothers alone of studios was this brave, courageous place that had stories about waitresses, stories about taxi drivers, and stories about little thugs trying to make it in the inner city.
Warner Brothers turned its attention to people outside of societies, like outlaws and gangsters. We had two people at the studio in particular, Jack Warner, who ran the studio, and the VP of production at this time, Darryl F. Zanuck, who were very, very fond of this sort of arc of the topical gangster.
The two earliest pictures in this collection, Little Caesar, Public Enemy, both had the advantage of having Darryl Zanuck in an overseeing role. And Zanuck, early in his career, spent a lot of time paying attention to detail.
Darryl Zanuck was a young man at the time. He was in his 20s. He was in touch with the trends in society, so to speak.
His stuff for the pulps and for the movies was topical. It was happening. If you're going to write about the common man, people who are recognizable to the audience, you're going to write what they know. They know the headlines of the paper.
Little Caesar is a movie based on a famous novel by W.R. Burnett, who lived in Chicago and knew everything about the local gangster scene. And the person who lorded over Chicago, of course, at this time is Al Capone. Now, Al Capone is extremely interesting in terms of the history of gangsters because he is the most public of all gangsters. He is a person who went out and talked to newspapermen, who went out to restaurants, who was quoted in the newspapers, who had his picture in the paper, a very visible kind of gangster.
Gee, you taking all these papers, Mr. Rico?
Why, sure, ain't I got my picture in them? Yeah.
Thanks. Come again.
At the time of Little Caesar's premiere, it was just generally accepted that it was based on Al Capone, and there was the problem.
There was a lot of outrage out there of having a gangster glamorized and made a figure with whom people in the audience were encouraged to identify.
We're only 3 years away from the Hollywood Code, in which the various conservative groups got together and really grabbed Hollywood and said, this stuff has got to stop. Crime has got to be punished in a very understandable way, in a way that the most ignorant audience is going to know that they should not be a criminal.
I told you no buzzard like you will ever put any cuffs on me.
You should have come out when I told you to, Rico.
When Little Caesar came out, Jack Warner could not have said, this is a thinly disguised Al Capone. He would have been sued. Who knows what Al Capone would have done to his studio. But years later, Jack Warner said he actually bought the novel because it was a thinly disguised portrait of Al Capone. That's why he made the movie. Edward G. Robinson, Rico Bandello was going to be Al Capone in a Warner's film. There are two stories of the casting of Edward G. Robinson as Rico Bandello. Now, Jack Warner says that Mervyn LeRoy, the director, had no interest in Edward G. Robinson for the role, but wanted this guy, this little-known actor, a guy named Clark Gable, to play the part. And, of course, Jack Warner said, that's ridiculous. He can't play Rico. And the reason is not that Clark was a bad actor. Clark Gable had big ears. We can't have a big-eared Rico Bandello. There's a different story from Mervyn LeRoy. He says he never intended Clark Gable to play Rico. He actually wanted him for the best friend part of Joe, which actually makes a lot of sense. But instead, that was Douglas Fairbanks Jr. But the same answer came from Jack Warner. The word from Jack Warner is that big-eared Clark Gable was not going to be in this picture. So poor Clark Gable had to go other places. He ended up at MGM, and the rest is cinema history.
You go back to that dame, and it's suicide. Suicide for both of you. You stick here.
Edward G. Robinson had already played a gangster at Warner's in 1930 in a film called The Widow from Chicago. So it's possible that Jack Warner found his Rico by simply looking on the Warner's lot. The casting in this movie of Edward G. Robinson is quite amazing because he looks like Al Capone. He really does. Although he's a Jewish actor, he's from Bucharest, Romania. He arrives in Hollywood and he right away is a gangster. He's a short guy, he's got a thick neck, he's got a flat nose, and all you do is you add a scar and you've got Al Scarface Capone.
Besides the reality of what Edward G. looked like, Besides the reality of his voice, the snarl, it was the reality of the character. Listen to his voice.
I told you to be here at 8:30.
Oh, well, you see, I was busy. I was rehearsing, and... Oh, well, you know how it is.
Yeah, I know how it is. They've been saying it in there, only I didn't believe them. They're crazy when they call you yellow.
Little Rico is a wonderful, a wonderful character, and Edward G. Robinson could do no wrong, particularly when he tells him, it's getting so you can dish it out, but you can't take it anymore.
Sam, you can dish it out, but you're getting so you can't take it no more. You're through.
He's really a fine actor, very authoritative, very strong, and very decisive.
Little Caesar has the bravura performance of Edward G. Robinson that makes the entire story work.
Just a minute, Sam. I got my own ideas of a split this time, and you can take it my way or leave it. We ain't begging you.
Yeah? Well, I bossed this job, and I'm going to get my split in the regular way or else.
How'd you boss this job? By sitting here in your office shooting yourself a solitaire? Well, that don't go no more. Not with me, it don't. We're done.
He's not at all like Rico. He was a very sophisticated, educated man. He was an immigrant who was very, very well read.
He was a very scholarly sort of fellow, not at all the tough gangster type that he appeared on the screen. He was a highbrow, if anything, a great art critic, collector of fine pictures, an intellectual who played tough guy parts.
And I kind of took pride in you, Joe. Brought you into the gang, pushed your head, but now you're getting to be a sissy.
We got to go into that again. Can't you just forget about me?
No, I don't want to forget, Joe. You're my pal.
So I learned a lot from him, from working with him. He was a great student of drama and a very gratifying job, and I was very pleased for the opportunity.
Little Caesar and his cigar. We always think of him chomping away as he brags and talks and plans his next crime. Well, in the novel, Little Caesar does not smoke a cigar. So this is a place where Warner Brothers, the studio, gets all the credit. Apparently, Mervyn LeRoy put it into the hand of Edward G. Robinson. Edward G. Robinson started chomping on it, and that became the trademark of not only Little Caesar, but of Edward G. Robinson in future roles, and in fact, become sort of an icon for gangster films. If you chomp on a cigar in a certain way, you are a gangster. In his hand, it becomes, as Freud would say, more than a cigar. It becomes a sign of authority, of aggression, and of his new kind of swagger as a gangster character. Little Caesar was made at the beginning of the sound era.
The two genres that really profited from the coming of sound were the musical, and, of course, and the gangster film, because you could hear the gunfire.
Noisy kind of stuff, and it's a perfect role for Little Caesar.
It really couldn't crystallize as fiercely as it did if it wasn't for sound on film.
As a film historian, I've always been fascinated by anti-American dream stories, and you can't get any better or worse than the story of Little Caesar.
Sure, boss. Pretty soon you'll be running the whole town.
Otero, you said a mouthful.
It's a great case study in which it shows a guy who completely buys into the American dream, Rico Bandello, this little gangster, and is completely willful and is completely self-centered and self-driven and spends all his day and night thinking about rises and rises and rises. He does everything right according to the American dream, and then he has this incredible tumble into the gutter, into the flop house.
Meteoric as was Rico's rise from the gutter, it was inevitable that he should return there.
You see the rise and the fall, and you see it through pride and arrogance and pretty much all the seven deadly sins, and it's very much a morality play in a way.
So you could say in a way that these films do personify in these characters the American dream in a very, skewed and strange way.
And I think he's a lot of Americans who who just are totally surprised that the American dream can work out in the worst way possible.
This is your last chance, Rico. Are you coming out or do you want to be carried out?
Seemingly, there were two ending shots of this movie. One in which Rico says, "Mother of Mercy, is this the end of Rico?" Another version in which he says, "The Mother of God, is this the end of Rico?"
They wanted to use Mother of God. Can this be the end of Rico? And of course, they felt that it would be considered a kind of blasphemy. I don't know how it could, but I think that's the word that came up, among the Catholic audience.
And Mother of Mercy is much more palatable, so Mother of Mercy is what we have in the release cut.
I think what's astonishing in Robinson's performance is he looks genuinely surprised to be dying. You would expect that someone who's been engaged in criminal activity that involves, killing and being shot at would not be so astonished.
Mother of Mercy. Is this the end of Rico?
That's become one of the great lines of movie history.
There was a vitality, a vigor and honesty in Public Enemy and Little Caesar. They're works of art that were not compromised by some kind of restrictive regime.
Little Caesar is a film that not only was a big box office hit in 1930, but has this resonance that makes us still look at it forever and ever.